introduce you to our own board member, Dr. Jim Codling, who is going to speak to us today on biblical translation. And Jim has got a doctor of theology as well as a doctor of education. And his last stint was as adjunct professor at Mississippi State University. So Jim is going to share with us today some biblical history.
Well, it's not actually biblical. Can you hear me? Is it coming through? Is this coming through? You can hear me? Okay, it's not actually biblical, but it is historical. And Tyndale, this is the 500th anniversary of his translation of the New Testament into English. And I have a couple of artifacts here. If you want to look at them, be careful with them because they're 100 years old. But this is from the 400th anniversary of Tyndale's translation. And they published this rather interesting little booklet. And then this little Bible, or New Testament, was the New Testament that was given to my father in 1925. It was an anniversary edition of the Tyndale's Bible. Unfortunately, we haven't been able to work the computer and the television together, and so therefore I'm just going to hold up pictures like this and you won't be able to see them, so it doesn't matter. But this is the 500th anniversary of Tyndale's translation of the New Testament. Although librarians and booksellers that I asked about Tyndale's books had absolutely no idea who he was, I feel he is a very important person, not just because he translated the New Testament into English, but that he, by doing so, really established what is our English language today. Because a lot of the phrases that he used are phrases that we have in modern English, and a lot of what was done with his translation was mainly put into the New Testament, or the King James Version of the Bible, which became the standard reading text for not just churches, but also schools throughout the Western world, that everyone that spoke English. It seems that from an early age, William was interested in education. He was a very driven young man, and probably was a little bit on the boring side because he was so driven. I heard a thing today about President Trump's son, and they said that he was a boring person because he went to class and then he went back to the dormitory and started studying. Well, that's probably what Tyndale did as well. And he prepared for his task at home. They did homeschooling, and then he went to Oxford and Cambridge, and in 1506 at Magdalen College, he graduated with, or 1512, he graduated with a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of Arts in 1515. And from there he went to Cambridge and continued his scholarly life. Now this was a special time in English history and actually European history, because this was the time of that classical learning became an important thing. The Turks had just taken Constantinople, so a lot of the Greek scholars left Constantinople and came to the West. And as they did, learning came with them. And one of these fellows who came to this area was a fellow by the name of Erasmus. Erasmus of Rotterdam was the fellow who brought the Greek language to the forefront, because he was the first person to write or collate the ancient texts into a Greek New Testament. And when he did that, it opened up a way that scholars then could translate the Greek into the English. Tyndale probably never ever attended lectures from Erasmus. Erasmus actually taught at Oxford for a while. And Dean Collett was the dean of the college at Oxford, and he also pushed the idea of original languages like Greek. Some claim that maybe he didn't learn Greek, or that he had to learn Greek on his own, but there was so many people around him that were pushing for that kind of thing, this classical language learning, that he probably had lots of different ways of learning, or a lot of different resources that he could learn Greek. And he seemed to be a scholar, seemed to be a linguist. He knew 7 different languages and knew them well, 2 of those being Greek and Hebrew. Now, I had to study 8 different languages for my doctorates and for my work on the reservation. However, if you ask me to speak a little Latin, all I can say is my father plays dominoes better than his father plays dominoes. That's it. So my language skills are not anything what his were. Another important thing that happened was the printing press. And the printing press was developed in Europe. And because the printing press was developed, it was a tool by which a fellow by the name of Martin Luther in Germany was able to publish a lot of his works. Those works came over to England. And as they did, this fellow, William Tyndale, started reading them. And he became convinced that they were the right way of thinking about theology. And so and one of the things they did in scholarly circles was sit around and discuss those kind of things. If you've been to university, sometimes you see little groups of professors sitting around discussing things. Maybe it's just women, but sometimes it actually is scholarly things. He became, in 1522, the tutor to a fellow by the name of John Walsh. And because his son was only 6 years old, actually he had other duties as well. And one of those was to be a chaplain to the family and preached at the local church. As he did this, Mrs. Walsh was one who loved to entertain people, and especially the clergy from the church. And so William Tyndale and the clergy sat down together at supper, and they would start discussing things. Tyndale took a Reformation viewpoint following Martin Luther's work, and the priests were obviously opposed. Mrs. Walsh got very upset at him for doing that, because she didn't want him to upset the priests, but he did anyway. And his beliefs put him into challenge when the chancellor of the diocese actually issued a summons against this young priest. He believed, and this quote, "It was impossible to establish the lay people in any truth except Scripture were plainly laid in their eyes in their mother tongue." It was made clear that Tyndale's disputation with a priest led to this famous words that he said, that if God spared his life ere many years, he would cause a boy that driveth the plow to know more Scripture than he did, that is, the priest did. And therefore, he was a driven man, driven to translate the Scriptures into English. To do this, then, he left that position and he went to London, because at that time you had to sanction the bishop in order to get permission to translate the works into English. Now, Tunstall was the bishop in London, and he just had become the bishop, and he was also advisor to Henry VIII. And because of this, he had a very tenuous position. When you just start out at a job, you want to be cool, you want to just go with the flow, right, for a while, unless you're Trump. But anyway, his position became, Tunstall's position became one that he was against Lutheranism, because Henry VIII was one who wrote a little document called Defender of the Faith, if you've heard of that, which was against Luther. Now, when Henry wrote that, he also included phrases in that which forbid the publication of anything of Scripture written in English. And so here you have a situation where Tyndale is trying to get this fellow, Tunstall, to sponsor him, which is what academics did in those days. You would be someone who studies hard, you would write a little piece of work and hand it to somebody and say, look how good I am at doing this, will you sponsor me? Well, Tunstall said no, he was not going to do it. So here he was sort of stuck in a position. He had left home, been in London for a while, doing sort of freelance stuff. And just like anybody who's in academia, my wife always accused me of being a professional student. Too many years at school. I can't take any more classes at university, she said. And so a professional student has to sometimes say, okay, that's it. I have to go get a real job. And so this is what Tyndale started thinking he had to do. He became a freelance writer for a while, but then he realized he could never publish a translation of the Bible in England because, one, Henry VIII had prescribed it, and two, there was a lot of difficulties in getting the money to do it there in England, plus the bishop was against him. So he left and went to Europe. And this fellow, Bishop Tyndale, saw his work, and he decided he was going to be against Tyndale. And so he got a fellow by the name of Sir Thomas More, and you've probably heard of him. Sir Thomas More, he said, you have the responsibility of weeding out the heresies in Tyndale's works. Tyndale just didn't translate the New Testament. He also wrote a number of books. And these books came into England, and as they did, Sir Thomas More would look at those and he would find the heresies in them. In fact, he and his compatriots, they say there were 200 different heresies that Tyndale had in his works. And in fact, this is what he said in reference to the Lord's Supper, how Tyndale viewed the Lord's Supper. I may and do against Tyndale and his fellows well and fully conclude that there is something necessary to believe that is beyond Scriptures. Now, for Tyndale, this was a bad thing, because Tyndale did not believe there was anything beyond Scripture that should be used in the church itself. So Tyndale said there is no further revelation. The Scripture, that is a final decider of Christian doctrine. And this was deprecated by More, who believed that authority rested in the church. Now, if you're Roman Catholic, I'm going to be insulting you because Tyndale insults More, okay? So don't feel badly. That's the way Tyndale did it. More considered Tyndale's works, all of them, to be heretical. The Roman Catholic Church was opposed to having Scriptures accessible to all people. They reasoned that it taught disobedience, and it was too hard to understand without the doctors. Some would argue even without Aristotle. More liked Aristotle. And therefore, Scriptures, the reading of Scriptures, makes heretics. That's what the Roman Catholic Church taught in England at that time. It makes heretics. And therefore it would follow that Tyndale, who held to those notions, would be a heretic. Now there's also the matter of interpretation. In the Roman Catholic Church, beginning with different of the early church fathers, they used a method of looking at Scriptures called allegory. Does everyone understand what allegory is? Do I need to give you a translation of that word? Oh, I see some strange looks on some people's faces, so I will. Allegory is taking a historical fact and making a spiritual truth out of that historical fact. For example, I heard this one in church one day where the preachers, and I saw this also online, where the preacher looked at the rebuilding of the temple by Nehemiah, Ezra, and Nehemiah, and they say there was rubble, and that rubble, they said, was the people of the world. So that's making a spiritual truth, and the people were rubble. That's making a spiritual truth out of a historical fact. That's allegory, and that was practiced in the Roman Catholic Church at that time. Well, Luther said, no, you can't do that. Tyndale read a lot of Luther, and he was convinced that was the way it was. Another example might be that, oh, I can't find it right now, but I'll come back to that. All right. This was the church's method of interpretation. The letter shows things done, that is, reading the letters that are there on the page. What you are to believe is the allegorical. What you're to do is the moral, and what you're to hope for is the anagogic. An example is this healing of the leper. When Jesus healed the leper, it's made allegorically into the healing of the soul in a lot of sermons, which Tyndale didn't like. And Tyndale pointed out that Chrysostom, back in the 3rd century, I think it was, and other church fathers opposed this allegorical exegesis of Scripture. Therefore, his methodology also put him at odds with the church and over such things as transubstantiation and the Lord's Supper. And he says, for allegory there is none. If you knew the proper difference of them both, which every grammarian can teach you, this would be true to you. So that was actually written in a work that he probably translated of Erasmus. Erasmus wrote this work on the how to interpret Scripture, and Tyndale, it's believed, he translated that into English as well. Moreover, if I could not prove with an open text that which the allegory doth express, then were the allegory a thing to be guessed at and of no greater value than a tale of Robin Hood, he says. Now that doesn't mean that he opposed figurative language, because many of the phrases we use in modern English are from him that are figurative language. For example, and I'll say it first of all in Old English, and then we can try and figure out in English, modern English. Look ye, thou lepe. In other words, look before you leap. Don't you say that? Guess who that came from? Tyndale. So he did use that figurative type language. And also he says, so when I say Christ is a lamb, I mean not a lamb that borroweth wool. Okay? So that he did love those figurative languages, but he had problems. There's obviously a political difference between Moore and Tyndale as well, and that was that Moore wrote the Utopia. And when you look at the, anybody read the Utopia? No, I didn't think so. It's not that interesting. But anyway, the Utopia is this socialist idea that Tyndale was against. In fact, C.S. Lewis said Moore should not have been knighted in London, but in Moscow, because he was very much a socialist. And Tyndale stressed the importance of each man working for God. This is a quote from him. There is no better work than to please God, to pour water, to wash dishes, to be a soter, that is a cobbler, or an apostle. All are one. To wash dishes and to preach, all are one, as touching the deed to please God. So that was his philosophy, as opposed to Moore's. There was a fellow by the name of Humphrey Munford who took Tyndale in while he was sort of struggling with what he was going to do in his life. And this Mumford was actually one that was persecuted by Moore later on in his life. Well, after a year in the city of London and a rebuff against translating scriptures, in May 1524 he left for Hamburg, and part of the reason is no English printer would print his work. 6,000 copies of the New Testament were printed at Worms and sent to England without his name. Now you can guess why he didn't put his name on it. Okay. Cardinal Wolsey, who was a cardinal there in England, through Archbishop Warham, bought up what he could. He bought all those books so they couldn't get into England. But he didn't realize when he bought all those books, the money went back to Tyndale, and he was able to use that money to publish more books. So it really didn't help Cardinal Wolsey at all. Wolsey was another major antagonist in Tyndale's fight to publish the English Bible. And Tyndale had a little nickname for him. He called him Wolfsey. My brother calls my mother Mumsy. Well, this is Wolfsey, he calls him. And he accused him of practicing astrology and necromancy, study of the dead, or the talking to the dead. Now, Wolsey got a hold of one of the copies of Tyndale's works called The Obedience of the Christian Man. And he got that from Anne Boleyn. And he read that, and he, along with a fellow by the name of Herman Rink, was able to warn the king of Tyndale's work. And he asked the king to search for Tyndale and ask the leaders of the borough of Cologne to push Tyndale out of that city. So Tyndale gathered up all his materials because he realized he was getting the boot, and he fled to Antwerp then. All right, so we have another fellow I just mentioned by the name of Henry VIII. Another problem, and you all know Henry VIII. I'm Henry VIII, I am Henry VIII, I am. I've been married 7 times before. Everyone was a Henry, right? No, you don't know that song. Okay, it's too old for you, right? Okay, Henry, anyway, wanted to have a male heir because women weren't good enough. You're all supposed to say boo now. Okay. And so Henry wanted to get rid of Catherine, his wife, which was a problem because she was related to Charles V, who was the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, which wasn't holy, but it was sort of an empire. And anyway, Tyndale was opposed to that because he did not feel divorce was right. Now that leads to a whole other section which we don't have time for about Tyndale's view on marriage and the priesthood and all that, so we won't get into that. But anyway, Henry was given the title, as I say, Defender of the Faith, and he moved from that point, Defender of the Faith, to the creator of the Anglican Church, the Church of England, over this area, this method of thinking called divorce. Now, when he says that, when I say that, you must also realize that Henry was very much influenced by people like Wolsey and Tunstall and others. And so a lot of what he said, he didn't really think through. One thing that Henry did in marrying Anne Boleyn, who followed Catherine, was he was influenced by her because she was a very striking young lady and very smart, and she read The Obedience of the Christian Man, which Tyndale wrote. This Obedience of the Christian Man said that all people should be loyal to their sovereign king. Well, for Henry, that was a good idea, right? Since he was king. And he said, every king, including myself, should read this book. Which was probably right, he should have, but he should have read all of it. Anyway, what happened is that he then gets his advisors to call Tyndale to to come back to England to be his political writer. You know all this, you've seen this on TV all the time. These politicians always have somebody give them the scoop to you, but it's not really themselves. Well, this is what he wanted Tyndale to do. Tyndale says, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm busy translating the Old Testament. And so he had to learn Hebrew to do that, to translate the Old Testament. He'd already translated the New Testament, 1525. Now he's working on the Old Testament. Well, Henry's a little rebuffed by that. No one refuses the king, right, Jim? Right. Nobody refuses the king. So, that's one mark against Tyndale. Then his advisors tell him, actually, Tyndale was against your divorce of Catherine. Strike number 2. All right? Strike number 3, all these things that Tyndale was doing against or in smuggling works into England, well, Henry didn't like any of that either. So 3 strikes, he sends his spies to try and find Tyndale in Antwerp and throughout Germany and in Netherlands, and they can't find him. He's too well hidden. He's got made a lot of friends over there. He actually sat and talked with Luther, and Luther's compatriots helped protect Tyndale over there. But there was another fellow, a fellow by the name of Philip, who was a man who came from a wealthy family, but you've heard these stories before. He gambled away all his inheritance. And he did a little bit of cheating on the side. And so he was actually called an enemy of the state by some people. Well, he is called aside. It's supposed that this was done by the cardinal, but it can't be proved. This was the fellow who followed Wolsey. It can't be proved. And so at least we know that he went over to Antwerp, and he found Tyndale, and he befriended him. And then one day he said, come on, let's go for a walk. Well, he had set a trap for Tyndale. They left his house and went for a walk, and immediately he was caught by the soldiers and thrown into the prison at this little place here. I don't know if you can see it or not. This castle here, which looks rather foreboding. Pass that around and see where he was. And at that castle, he is thrown into prison and waits there for his trial. During that time, he's still driven to translate. And so one of the things that he says is, I can't find the exact quote here. Anyway, one of the things he says is, it's dark, so if you'll let me have a candle or two, that would be wonderful. And then he says, I would like, and he's talking to the governor of the castle, who looks after the prison, I would like you to give me my Hebrew Bible, the grammar, and the word book, translation book, so that I can write and translate more of the translations from Hebrew into English, which he wasn't able to complete the whole translation, but he did write a number of the works, and this was eventually put into Matthew's Bible and the Cloverdale Bible, and then in 1611 the King James Version of the Bible. So when you read the King James Version of the Bible, you are actually reading a lot of what Tyndale wrote. All the New Testament and a good part of the Old Testament was what Tyndale had written. He was then found guilty of heresy, and in those days you just weren't killed once, but he was strangled and then he was burnt. So that's how they did it. I guess we're out of time. And I'll just stop there. You can give me any questions you want if you want. Nobody has any questions, Pam?
So before he was translating into English, the Bible was basically in Latin.
The Bible was written by Jerome in the 4th century. It was called the Vulgate. It was only in Latin. Right. All the church services were in Latin. So if you were a common plowboy or whatever, you wouldn't be able to understand anything going on in church. And although most people didn't have much of an education for reading, you couldn't read anyway because it was in Latin rather than English.
So apparently they thought that normal people reading the Bible would become heretics, that they could read it and they were okay.
Yes, but the terrible thing was a lot of priests didn't know much Latin either. So
they were heretics too.
well, they just didn't know it. Yes, ma'am.
Did Tyndale also know Sanskrit?
I don't believe so.
No, okay.
I never read that he did that. It was the European languages that he looked at, Latin and Hebrew and Greek.
Wasn't a lot of the Bible in Greek also, or it had been translated into Greek?
The Old Testament was translated into Greek in Alexandria. It was called the Septuagint, writing of 70, and there's a story behind that, but I won't go into that either. But so when Jesus' time, there was both the Masoretic text written in Hebrew and Aramaic, and the Septuagint, which was written in Greek, translated into Greek. And some of the New Testament writers, you can tell, were actually looking at the Greek Old Testament. Some were looking at the Masoretic text.
And were there writings about Jesus in Sanskrit?
Was there what?
Writings about Jesus in Sanskrit.
Now, there are theories that say, yes, there were, but in my opinion, they are pushed a little bit. And I don't know Sanskrit, so I really couldn't read that for you. Yes, Pam?
The Jewish people of that time, they would have been using the Hebrew scriptures.
Yes.
They had. And then who translated that Hebrew into the Greek? Who did that?
That was done at the time of one of the descendants of Alexander. Alexander the Great conquered that whole area, and he established a city of Alexandria in northern part of Egypt. And there they had a huge library, and at that library they did a lot of translating work. 70 different scholars from 70 different places were brought in apparently to write this in Greek, the Hebrew Bible translated into Greek.
And who used that? And it wouldn't have been the Jews. Who would have
Yes, Jews used that too if they could read Greek. Paul probably used that.
Paul probably. Okay.
And Mark probably used that as well.
So a lot of the Jews might have known Hebrew and Greek.
Yes, Greek was the language of commerce. It was the language which united that whole area together. It was actually the language that would have helped in the spread of the gospel out from Israel to the rest of the world, because everybody spoke Greek. Hebrew was only spoken in that one little area in Judea and Galilee and Samaria, with a little twist to that, sort of like southern. Yes?
So when did Latin become the main?
Latin became the main language for the Roman Catholic Church as soon as the church came into Rome. So at the time when Paul would have been in Rome as a prisoner, he would have had to be familiar with the Latin of that area. The Roman Empire had two official languages, Greek in the eastern part and Latin in the western part. And when Jerome wrote in the 4th century, that was the Bible that he wrote was Latin.
And he translated that from the Greek or from the Hebrew?
Jerome from the Hebrew and the Greek.
Both.
Right.
So Jim, isn't it true that the Greek church, what we call Eastern Orthodox now, they didn't have a problem with translating anything because the Bible, they had both the Hebrew scriptures translated into Greek, and the New Testament was already Greek, so they never had
a problem.
this drama.
Right. No, they didn't.
It's just in the Western Roman Empire that basically broke off from the East. And as I understand it, the Roman Empire continued in the East until the 1400s.
Yes, till Constantinople fell.
And we don't ever think about that. We think about the Roman Empire falling in 600 or whatever it was. It was just in the West.
Yeah.
And the church took over the rule of that territory. The Roman Catholic Church was basically
the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope, during the time of Constantine, had a letter, which was a fake letter, by the way, but he had a letter that says that the rule of the western part of the Roman Empire belonged to the Pope, because the Eastern Empire, that's where the emperor was in the East, because Constantinople was a much nicer place to live than in Rome, so he moved to Constantinople.
So this is all tied up in politics.
Oh yeah, lots of politics.
Did they have a pope in Constantinople too?
No, the Eastern Orthodox Church does not have a pope. And they were a little bit different than the Roman Catholic Church.
One more question?
I don't know if this is a question, but
Okay.
one of the things that I've always been fascinated by, I think in the year 1511, King Henry and Catherine, Baragon, had a child, and it was a male child.
Yes, Edward.
And that child is probably one of the most influential persons in in world history, because one thing he did was he died.
Yes.
And if he hadn't died, the whole trajectory of the world would have been different. There would have been no rift with the church. There would have been no Henry's got to marry all these different people. There would have been the place we're living in today would have been an entirely different place. So I guess that's the butterfly effect.
It's very interesting. And, Jim, thank you very much. And it obviously prompts a lot of questions about what went on in history, right? So that's very good. We may look to see how to expand this topic. But anyway, so thank you very much for your time. Very good, and we hope to see you all again.